Hi, this is Dr. Oben. I want to talk to you about something quite confusing for a lot of my patients, or those who come to me who are interested in weight loss medications. Tirzepatide, Mounjaro, Zepbound, confusion. What's the difference? Are they the same? If they are, and what's the difference between if they are the same, then how do I get the same stuff? Or when I get something just the compounded, I'm told it's not the same as Zepbound or Mounjaro. And if they are not the same, what's the difference? And it gets even worse. Not just there's a difference, not just the fact that there's a difference between Tirzepatide and Mounjaro Zepbound, but there's a difference between Zepbound and Mounjaro. So let's talk about that today. It's very easy to understand, not complicated at all. Now, the difference between Tirzepatide, Mounjaro, and Zepbound, to make it easy to understand, let's talk about the difference between Tirzepatide, Mounjaro as a group versus just Tirzepatide, right? Or let's see, I can group Tirzepatide by itself, the generic, or you can call it the active ingredient, or you can call it the active molecule. And then Zepbound and Mounjaro can fall in their own class by themselves. So that's the first level of difference. The second level, which might get even more confusing, is even within that class of Mounjaro and Tirzepatide, there's a difference between the two. So let's start with the first. What is the difference between Tirzepatide in one on the one hand and Mounjaro Zepbound on the other? It goes back to how medications really are, are made, right? Now, there is a difference between the active ingredient of a medication and the branded version of the medication. The easiest way to explain it is to use something which most of us are familiar with: Tylenol. Tylenol is a brand name, it comes from a specific manufacturer. But that brand name has an active ingredient or active molecule in it, which is called acetaminophen, or the rest of the world knows it as paracetamol. So Tylenol and acetaminophen, they are essentially the same, but there is a major difference. Tylenol is acetaminophen that is produced by a specific company, and usually those companies go through rigorous research. In fact, it takes years to do those research. They submit the application to the FDA. It gets approved. So Tylenol is coming from a company that has gone through FDA approval, and they have that brand name Tylenol. You know, it's so common that many of us do not even think about it. We think Tylenol is Tylenol. No, Tylenol is a specific branded name for the medication acetaminophen. So acetaminophen is available for anyone else to produce. There are different companies, different pharmacies that produce acetaminophen, but it's not going to be called Tylenol because Tylenol is reserved. So that's the difference between Tirzepatide, which is the active molecule or the active ingredient in all of this medication. It's the same. Of course, the same molecule. However, Zepbound or Mounjaro, they are branded versions of Tirzepatide, meaning there is a company, Lilly, that went through the research, submitted to the FDA, and got the approval. So the name Zepbound is Tirzepatide that has gone through FDA approval, submitted by Lilly. So what's the difference between Tirzepatide and Zepbound or Mounjaro? Mounjaro or Zepbound, they are just specific formulations, the branded formulations of Tirzepatide. You can have Tirzepatide from many different companies and pharmacies right now, but only one went through the FDA approval process. That is the one from Lilly. You can call it Zepbound or you can call it Mounjaro. So hope that is clear. It's very easy to understand, not very complicated at all from the outside. When you look at it, these names are a little confusing. But no, terzepatide is the active molecule, and Zepbound or Mounjaro, they are branded version. One other important difference, it's not just the FDA approval. When Lilly creates the version of terzepatide, besides the active ingredient, there are other things which are within the medication. Right? For example, when you're getting a shot of Zepbound, it's not just the terzepatide, right? The medication itself is there, but there are other molecules. There are other things that the company has to add for different reasons, whether stability or help with absorption. It's very complicated. What that means is Zepbound is terzepatide and some extra molecules, extra stuff that is specific to Lilly. When another pharmacy makes Zepbound or creates the generic version of Zepbound, those other stuff might also be different, as you can imagine. Right? It cannot exactly be the same as the one that comes from Lilly, meaning for example, if Lilly had a molecule A to make terzepatide more stable, a different pharmacy might use molecule B. They might still use the same terzepatide as the active ingredient, but they'll use different molecules around it. So when you're getting terzepatide from a different pharmacy, you are getting the exact molecule, terzepatide, but with extra stuff, which might be different, which really explains the difference between compounded and branded version of these medications, which I'll probably talk about that tomorrow. But at least you get the gist, right? So terzepatide is the active ingredient, and when another pharmacy creates it or manufactures it, it comes with extra stuff, right? That might be a little bit different from what the brand company, the parent company itself would produce. So that helps clear the air a tiny little bit. Now let's get to the more interesting stuff. So what then is the difference between terzepatide as Mounjaro and terzepatide as Zepbound? And this is where things get even more confusing. They are coming from the same company, Lilly. This is just an issue very specific to the US. It has to do with a play of names for FDA indications. For example, every medication needs to be approved by the FDA with a very specific indication, meaning the FDA doesn't simply say, you're clear, you're approved. It says this medication is approved, is safe, it's effective for treating diabetes in this particular scenario. So that is what is called an FDA indication. That is important, especially for insurance coverage. Mounjaro is the branded version of Tirzepatide, which is FDA approved for treating type 2 diabetes. It is coming from the same manufacturer, it is the same medication. It is just the FDA approval that is different. And of course, as you now can imagine, there might be a little bit of a difference in the other stuff which are inside the medication, right? But it's coming from the same company, probably not a lot of difference. How about Zepbound? Zepbound is also terzepatide, coming from the same company, but having the FDA approval for treating obesity or for causing weight loss. So the difference between Zepbound and Mounjaro is just the FDA approval and, of course, the names. It's a play of names. They are essentially the same stuff. However, very rare situations, I've heard somebody tell me they just couldn't tolerate Mounjaro, but they could tolerate Zepbound. Pretty strange, right? And now you probably know why. It is not the Tirzepatide in the Mounjaro or Zepbound. It is the other stuff that is found there. It might be very tiny, little amounts, but they can add up. And in fact, for some patients, the little stuff might be so important that they can't even tolerate a medication. Not because they cannot tolerate the name itself, the active ingredient itself. It's just because the other stuff, they are probably allergic to it, they can't tolerate it, and things don't work out for them. So, for the majority of us who are taking this medication, there's really going to be no major difference between Mounjaro and Zepbound. They are the same medication, active ingredient coming from the same company, which have two different FDA approvals. One, Mounjaro for diabetes, Zepbound for obesity. Why is this so critical? Just imagine if I prescribe Mounjaro for someone who wants to lose weight, and I'm seeking to have the insurance company pay for that medication. They are going to look at my prescription, and guess what they're going to tell me? No, Mounjaro is not FDA approved for treating obesity. So I have to send Zepbound. And I've seen some interesting things with these insurance companies. Sometimes they I've had a patient where the insurance company preferred to pay for Mounjaro than Zepbound, and the reason was cost. You see? So there is a lot going on when it comes to medications, right? It can get really complicated. There are ethical issues, there are financial interests, and of course, there is medical issues and science. However, the basics remain the same. Now you know the basics. You know the difference between Tirzepatide, Zepbound, and Mounjaro. If you have any questions, put them in the comment below. I will be more than happy to respond to you when time allows. And tomorrow, I will be talking about compounded versus brand name versions of this medication. What is the difference? See you then. Bye.